In the year 1570, the world had a sole superpower, Spain, whose flag flew from Manila to Mexico City, from the peaks of Peru to the ports of Naples. But this empire was never designed to create prosperity. It was engineered as a weapon, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. And like any weapon fired too often, the recoil was catastrophic. Spain controlled the tercios, infantry formations that were the special forces of their age, drilled to perfection and feared across every battlefield in Europe. Maintaining them required something most kingdoms couldn't provide: endless cash. That's where the Americas came in, with silver convoys arriving at Seville every year carrying tons of gleaming bars stamped with the royal seal. But this wasn't wealth in the way we understand it. It wasn't seed capital for industries or investments in infrastructure, but rather fuel for the military machine. The empire ran on silver the way a modern war machine runs on oil. Here's the paradox that defined Spain's century. The treasure that made it invincible was also the addiction that ensured its collapse. Spain didn't spend its fortune building a resilient nation, but instead poured every ounce into financing wars for God and glory, foreign wars, distant wars, wars that never ended and never turned a profit. The crown saw silver shipments not as an opportunity, but as an obligation to fight harder, to send more men, to launch more campaigns. The wealth flowed in and flowed right back out, straight into the hands of enemies and creditors. While Madrid was orchestrating invasions across 3 continents, Spain itself was withering from within. Picture the empire as a furnace, where American silver was the fuel feeding the flames. But those flames weren't warming the Spanish hearth. They were forging swords in Germany, building warships in Italy, and paying mercenaries in Flanders. The heat generated wealth everywhere except home, where roads crumbled and farms were abandoned. Spanish industries couldn't compete because every available peso was earmarked for the next campaign, and the countryside emptied as young men marched north to fight in the Netherlands, never to return. The silver passed through Spain like water through a sieve, enriching foreign arms dealers, German bankers, and Italian shipwrights who built fleets with Spanish gold. But Castile, the beating heart of the empire, was left cold and hollow as the crown treated its own kingdom as a resource to be extracted, rather than a society to be nurtured. Tax collectors squeezed harder every year to keep the war machine fed, and when the people had nothing left to give, the king borrowed against future silver shipments that hadn't even left the mines yet. This was the engine of empire, not innovation, not trade, not prosperity, but an endless cycle of extraction and expenditure, where the richest nation on earth was building nothing permanent. It was burning its inheritance to fight wars that served no economic purpose, and the men making the decisions believed with absolute conviction that this was the only path, because for them, this wasn't about wealth, it was about faith. Philip II inherited the throne in 1556, and with it came something far heavier than a crown, a divine mandate that he believed was written into his very bloodline. To him, Spain wasn't just a kingdom with interests to manage and borders to defend. It was the chosen instrument of God on earth, tasked with defending Catholicism against the rising tide of Protestant heresy and the ever-present threat of the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't politics as we understand it today. It was theology dressed in armor, and every military campaign was a holy crusade that transcended any concern about budgets or sustainability. The Habsburg kings operated under a dangerous logic that would doom generations. If the cause was righteous, then God would ensure victory, and the funds would somehow materialize when needed. This belief justified borrowing impossible sums against future treasure shipments that hadn't even been mined yet, turning the empire's financial system into a faith-based gamble. When advisors warned about mounting debts or when the treasury ran dry, Philip had an answer rooted not in economics but in conviction. Abandoning these wars would be a sign of weak faith, not fiscal prudence. Consider what this mindset meant in practical terms. Spain fought not to gain territory that could be profitably governed, not to secure trade routes that would enrich merchants, but to prove a point about religious purity. The wars in the Netherlands, the campaigns against England, the naval battles in the Mediterranean. These weren't investments designed to generate returns, but rather expenditures justified by their moral righteousness. When the Spanish Armada was assembled in 1588 to invade England, over 10 million ducats were spent, the equivalent of 2 full years of royal revenue, all for an enterprise that ended in spectacular failure. And when the fleet was destroyed, Spain didn't reconsider its strategy or scale back its ambitions. It simply borrowed more money to rebuild and prepared for the next campaign. This created a feedback loop of escalating commitment where each failure demanded more resources to restore lost honor, and each success demanded more resources to capitalize on momentum. The crown couldn't afford to lose, but it also couldn't afford to win, because winning meant defending new territories and launching new offensives that required even more silver. For Philip and his successors, retreat was unthinkable, because it would mean admitting that God's favor had limits, that perhaps the divine mandate had conditions attached. And so they kept fighting, kept borrowing, kept sending convoys of silver across the ocean to fund wars that served no purpose beyond proving that Spain was still willing to bleed for its beliefs. Behind every war machine stands a group of men who know how to profit from someone else's crusade. And for Spain, those men were the Genoese bankers who saw an opportunity that most would have considered insane. They weren't patriots or believers in the divine mandate. They were financiers who identified an addict with what appeared to be an inexhaustible credit line in the form of American silver. These banking syndicates, families with names like Spinola and Centurione, operated out of quiet offices in Genoa and understood a fundamental truth that the Spanish crown refused to acknowledge. Future wealth is only valuable if you survive long enough to collect it. The system they created was called the asiento, and it functioned as a masterclass in predatory lending disguised as partnership. Here's how it worked. The crown needed cash immediately to pay soldiers marching toward Flanders or to outfit another armada, but the silver was still in the ground, thousands of miles away in Potosi. The Genoese would advance the money up front in exchange for the right to collect Spain's future income. Not just the principal, but with interest rates that compounded into staggering sums. Essentially, Spain was selling pieces of its sovereignty, mortgaging tomorrow's empire to fight today's battles. When Spain inevitably defaulted, and it did so repeatedly in 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1597, the bankers didn't panic or walk away. Instead, they returned to the negotiating table with even greater leverage, demanding more collateral, higher interest rates, and deeper access to royal revenues. Each default tightened the financial noose around the empire's neck, transforming what had begun as loans into a system where foreign creditors essentially controlled Spain's cash flow. The crown couldn't stop borrowing, because the wars couldn't stop, and the bankers knew this addiction guaranteed their returns. Even when the official payments failed, they weren't just lending money. They were harvesting the future of an empire that was too proud to admit it was already bankrupt. Of all the wars that Spain could have walked away from, the conflict in the Netherlands stands as the most catastrophic example of how addiction overrides reason. What began in 1568 as a rebellion against Spanish rule in the Low Countries transformed into an 80-year quagmire that consumed generations of Spanish soldiers, mountains of silver, and any remaining illusion that the empire fought for rational objectives. This wasn't a war Spain could win, and by the early 1600s everyone knew it. Everyone except the men in Madrid, who kept signing orders to send more troops north. The Dutch had something Spain didn't: a clear financial strategy where taxes on beer and other commodities funded their defense in ways that were sustainable and tied directly to their economic capacity. Meanwhile, Spain was financing its Army of Flanders, a force that regularly numbered 60,000 men or more, through a logistical nightmare known as the Spanish Road. This overland supply route stretched from northern Italy through the Alps, across the Rhineland, and into the Netherlands, covering over 700 miles of hostile or neutral territory. Every soldier, every cannon, every wagon of supplies had to traverse this corridor, and the cost was staggering. Not just in gold, but in diplomatic capital spent negotiating passage rights and bribing local rulers. The crown poured an estimated 300 million ducats into the Netherlands war over its duration, money that could have rebuilt Spain's cities, developed its industries, or created infrastructure that would generate wealth for centuries. Instead, it vanished into the swamps of Flanders, paying soldiers whose wages were chronically in arrears and who periodically mutinied when the silver shipments from Seville arrived late or not at all. The famous mutinies of the Army of Flanders, where unpaid troops would sack friendly cities to collect what they were owed, became a recurring scandal that undermined Spain's reputation and military effectiveness. Yet the response from Madrid was never to question the war itself, but rather to borrow more money, promise the troops their back pay, and continue the campaign as if victory was just one more offensive away. By the 1620s, when the war resumed after a 12-year truce, Spain was functionally bankrupt, its economy shattered by decades of mismanagement and its population declining from constant military conscription. But still the tercios marched north, still the silver flowed along the Spanish Road, and still the Dutch refused to surrender, building dikes to flood the countryside and financing their defense through innovative taxation and a thriving merchant economy. The Netherlands War became the defining symbol of Spain's pathology, a forever war fought for pride, for ideology, for everything except a coherent strategy that might actually benefit the Spanish people. It was addiction in its purest form, destructive, compulsive, and impossible to quit, even as it destroyed everything around it. There's a limit to how much weight any body can carry before it begins to break down from within, and by the 1640s, Spain's internal structure was fracturing under pressures that the crown had ignored for decades. The constant demand for money and soldiers to feed foreign wars had created unbearable strain on the regions that formed the backbone of the empire, particularly Castile, which bore a disproportionate share of the tax burden, while other territories negotiated exemptions or paid far less. The Castilian heartland was being bled dry to finance campaigns in Flanders and Italy, and the resentment was building into something that would soon explode. In 1640, the breaking point arrived simultaneously, across multiple fronts, in what historians call the Crisis of 1640, when the empire's addiction to foreign wars triggered rebellions within its own borders. Catalonia rose in revolt during what became known as the Reapers' War, sparked by the presence of Spanish troops quartered in Catalan towns who behaved more like occupiers than defenders, pillaging and demanding resources that the locals could no longer provide. The same year, Portugal, which had been absorbed into the Spanish crown since 1580, declared its independence and began a restoration war that would last 28 years and drain even more resources from an already exhausted treasury. These weren't external enemies attacking the empire. This was the empire's own body, rejecting the poison that had been coursing through its veins for generations. The tax burden that funded these distant wars had pushed the Spanish population past the point of endurance, with the millones tax and the alcabala creating crushing obligations on commerce and daily life that made prosperity impossible for ordinary people. Entire regions were depopulated, as young men were conscripted generation after generation, sent north to die in the Netherlands or east to fight in Italy, creating a demographic collapse that shattered the economic foundation of Castile. Cities that had once thrived, Toledo, Segovia, Granada, saw their populations decline and their industries wither, as there simply weren't enough people left to work the trades or maintain the infrastructure. The addiction wasn't just consuming the empire's wealth, it was literally consuming its people, turning productive regions into ghost towns haunted by the memory of what they had been before the wars devoured everything. The Crown's response to these internal rebellions revealed how deeply the addiction had taken hold. Rather than scale back foreign commitments to address domestic collapse, Spain continued fighting on all fronts simultaneously, spreading itself so thin that it couldn't effectively suppress the rebellions or win the foreign wars. The same silver that could have rebuilt Catalan infrastructure or negotiated a peaceful settlement with Portugal was instead sent along the Spanish road to pay soldiers fighting Dutch rebels who would never surrender. The empire was fighting wars against its own people while maintaining crusades abroad, a perfect illustration of how addiction destroys from within, even as the addict insists that everything can be managed with just one more hit, one more campaign, one more loan, against a future that was rapidly disappearing. While Spain was bankrupting itself, fighting for God and glory, one of its rivals was taking a completely different approach to conflict, one that treated war not as a sacred duty, but as a business opportunity with measurable returns. England, under Elizabeth I, understood something fundamental that the Spanish crown never grasped. Power isn't built by spending wealth, but by creating systems that generate more of it. Instead of financing massive standing armies to fight ideological crusades, England deployed state-sponsored privateers who functioned less like soldiers and more like venture-backed entrepreneurs with cannons. Francis Drake wasn't a general leading campaigns for abstract principles. He was essentially a pirate CEO whose expeditions were designed to deliver returns to his investors, chief among them the Queen herself. When Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, he didn't just harass Spanish shipping. He returned with enough captured treasure that Elizabeth's personal share alone was worth more than her entire annual royal revenue. And the expedition generated a 47-to-1 return for its investors. This wasn't war as Spain practiced it. This was strategic raiding designed to weaken a rival, while simultaneously funding England's own development. The captured Spanish silver didn't vanish into foreign battlefields or get consumed paying mercenaries for unwinnable wars. Instead, England reinvested it into building a more advanced navy, with better ship designs and superior gunnery, creating assets that would compound in value over time. The English also pioneered joint stock companies, innovative financial structures that pooled capital from multiple investors to fund exploration, trade, and colonial ventures that generated ongoing revenue streams. While Spain was mortgaging its future to Genoese bankers for the privilege of fighting today's battles, England was building institutions designed to create wealth for generations. The contrast couldn't be starker. England waged war to build an economy, systematically targeting Spanish treasure fleets and using the proceeds to develop commercial and naval infrastructure. Spain, meanwhile, was dismantling its economy to wage war, draining its heartland to fund crusades that produced nothing but casualties and debt. One was a calculated investment in future power, where each raid and each naval engagement was measured against its potential return. The other was compulsive expenditure driven by ideology, where success was measured not in profit, but in faithfulness to a divine mandate that cared nothing for balance sheets. England was playing a different game entirely, and by treating conflict as a tool for economic advancement rather than an end in itself, it was positioning itself to inherit the world that Spain was busy destroying. The story of Spain's addiction to unwinnable wars isn't just a historical curiosity filed away in dusty archives. It's a recurring pattern that echoes through the centuries whenever great powers confuse military action with strategic wisdom. Spain's forever war in the Netherlands, fought for decades at astronomical cost, with no clear path to victory, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to modern conflicts justified by abstract values rather than concrete strategic goals that benefit the homeland. The language changes, the technology evolves, but the fundamental logic remains the same. We must continue fighting, because abandoning the mission would mean admitting that all the previous sacrifice was for nothing. So, what are our modern equivalents of American silver? The seemingly inexhaustible resource that enables nations to fight beyond their means. In today's world, it's the ability to print reserve currency, to accumulate debt that appears limitless, to finance military operations through mechanisms that create the illusion of sustainability while mortgaging the future. Spain's monarchs borrowed against silver shipments that hadn't been mined yet, believing that God would provide and that tomorrow's wealth would cover today's wars. Modern powers borrow against economic growth that may never materialize, convinced that strategic necessity justifies any level of expenditure, and that fiscal constraints don't apply when national security is invoked. The true cost, then and now, is what gets neglected while attention and resources flow toward distant battlefields. While Spain was pouring silver into Flanders, its roads crumbled, its industries withered, and its cities depopulated as generations of young men marched off to die in wars that served no tangible national interest. The pattern repeats when nations obsessed with projecting power abroad watch their own infrastructure decay, their social cohesion fracture, and their economic vitality drain away. Because the resources that could have built a thriving society are instead consumed by forever wars that generate nothing but casualties and contractors. Spain's empire became a weapon aimed at its enemies, but the recoil shattered its own foundation, a warning carved into history for anyone willing to read it. The question isn't whether a nation can afford to wage war, because any sufficiently powerful state can find ways to finance military operations for decades if it's willing to sacrifice enough. The real question is whether those wars are building something or merely burning resources to avoid admitting failure. Whether the homeland is strengthened or hollowed out in the process, and whether future generations will inherit prosperity or just the bills for their ancestors' compulsive crusades. Spain had the wealth to become something enduring, but it chose to become a weapon instead. And that choice, repeated across generations despite mounting evidence of its destructiveness, is what transforms an empire into a cautionary tale. Spain's collapse wasn't an accident of fate or the inevitable result of forces beyond anyone's control. It was a choice, made deliberately and repeatedly by leaders who valued ideology over pragmatism, glory over prosperity, and crusades over the welfare of their own people. At every critical junction where the empire could have shifted course, where advisors warned about unsustainable debts and demographic collapse, where the evidence of failure was overwhelming, the Spanish crown chose to escalate rather than adapt. They chose to borrow more from Genoese bankers rather than develop domestic industries, to send more troops into the Netherlands rather than accept a negotiated peace, to continue taxing Castile into ruin rather than spreading the burden or reducing military commitments. This pattern of choice reveals something uncomfortable about how great powers decline. It's rarely a sudden catastrophe, but rather a slow-motion surrender to addiction, where each decision seems justifiable in isolation, but together they form a staircase descending into irrelevance. Spain had alternatives at every step. It could have invested its silver in infrastructure and education, could have built trading networks instead of maintaining armies, could have chosen to become a wealthy nation rather than merely a powerful weapon. But those alternatives required admitting that the divine mandate might have limits, that perhaps God's favor required wisdom rather than just faith, and that true strength comes from building something sustainable rather than demonstrating willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract principles. The empire built as a weapon ultimately fired on itself, the recoil shattering the very foundation that made its power possible in the first place. The American silver that could have funded a renaissance of science, art, and commerce instead became the drug that fueled a spectacular downfall, flowing through Spain's veins, but poisoning everything it touched. By the time the Spanish people and their leaders recognized what was happening, and they did recognize it, with contemporaries writing extensively about the descent they were witnessing, the addiction had progressed too far to reverse without catastrophic withdrawal. The cycles of borrowing, bankruptcy, and renewed borrowing had created a system where stopping meant admitting that generations of sacrifice had been for nothing. So they continued, even as the evidence of doom mounted. History doesn't offer answers, only warnings, carved into the ruins of empires that believed they were exceptional. Spain's story whispers across the centuries that a nation's true resilience isn't found in its capacity to wage war, to project power across distant battlefields, or to demonstrate unwavering commitment to ideological purity. Real resilience lives in the wisdom to build a society worth defending, to invest in the homeland rather than neglect it for foreign crusades, and to recognize that wealth is only meaningful if it creates lasting prosperity rather than merely funding the next campaign. The anatomy of collapse is the anatomy of choice, and every generation must decide whether it will build or merely burn, whether it will invest in the future or consume it to avoid facing the present.